Hello, everyone. Good morning. We have an amazing guest today. It's Colin Morgan from Apraciti. He is an expert in, I think, pretty much everything cybersecurity when it comes to medical devices, honestly. And he's going to give a small presentation on the purchasing process for medical devices when it comes to cybersecurity. And then we'll open it up to some Q&A. And it's kind of a small group today, so I think we can have kind of a more influential, small talk with people, and everything will be recorded. So feel free, I'll send out the recording links afterwards, and you can send that out to your contacts and friends, and so they can join in as well. Anywho, without further ado, I'll pass it off to Colin.
Great, thank you, Daniel, and thank you everyone for taking the time here. And I appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to you about some of the interesting changes that have been happening in the medical device cybersecurity realm, specifically focused around the providers and where they're headed. But first, I wanted to give a bit of background, just a perspective of where I'm coming from. So again, my name is Colin Morgan. Here's a photo of me here. I've been working in the technology and cybersecurity field for about 2 decades. Most of my background is in the systems engineering, network engineering, and security domains. So I spent a little bit of time working as a network engineer for the Central Intelligence Agency. Worked as a systems, network, and security engineer on a supercomputing program with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And then my previous role before this one was working for a large healthcare conglomerate, working in several aspects but in the business, but also for the past probably about 5 years working in the medical device cybersecurity space. So working on a variety of devices in development, devices in the marketplace with regulatory bodies and such. So I've been living and breathing medical device security for a number of years now, and have had the opportunity to learn and to go through the experience along this journey with everyone else, which has been pretty fun. Quick background on my business. We started in March of this year, focusing specifically on medical device security, and it's really primarily for medical device manufacturers. So the 2 elements to our organization are to support manufacturers in building out the programmatic capabilities for their organization. So things like their processes for pre-market, threat modeling, risk assessment, post-market elements of the end-to-end workflow, how you would manage a cybersecurity event, how all of that fits into the quality management system. So for example, how does your security risk analysis integrate with your safety risk analysis? How does your threat monitoring, your post-market tracking, your incident response, incident management fit into things like complaint handling, product risk assessment, the quality board escalation processes? So really kind of working through those elements. And then the second side of this is focused on doing some of the security engineering work for products in development, and even supporting some of the ones on the market. So doing the threat modeling, the requirements documentation, evaluating controls that are in place, helping pull together the packets for submissions to regulatory bodies, and looking at the full end-to-end of that product. So like I mentioned, predominantly on the medical device manufacturer side, and helping in these elements to ensure that we're all moving in the right direction. Like I said, I've been working in the space for a while, and seeing how challenging these issues have been coming about, and the swift changes from not only the regulatory agencies but also the provider side drove me to step out and try to help more organizations work through these challenges. So shifting gears, really I'm here to talk a bit about from the manufacturing side, what is going on with the purchasing process in hospitals. So as I'm sure many of you are familiar, or familiar directly or indirectly, many of the hospitals and the healthcare delivery organizations have been changing their practices around how they look at medical devices and how they go through purchasing them. There's a significant amount of changes around contract language, processes they're requiring. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that, share a couple examples and use cases, and then, like Daniel mentioned, have some time in the end for Q&A here to talk through any questions that anyone might have. But first, I want to talk a bit about the roles and responsibilities between medical device manufacturers and healthcare delivery organizations, because we hear a lot of the term shared responsibility. There's some guidance that the US FDA has out there that talks about how device security is a shared responsibility between manufacturers and HDOs. And the predominant reason for that is that the manufacturers are designing, developing, and maintaining these devices. However, the hospitals are running them in their own clinical environments. And we see many use cases of manufacturers when they run the device they're responsible for maintenance agreements. They may provide admin access to the device for the hospital, they may not. The hospital may want the devices to connect into their Active Directory, LDAP, their login environments. They may not. Manufacturers may let them and may not let them. So there are a number of different scenarios that are in play when an organization creates a device and sells it to a hospital. And ensuingly, there's a number of different types of requirements that come from hospitals depending upon the type of device that you're selling to them. And now a lot of this is getting even more complicated when you talk about the connectivity aspect. So the majority of devices are being connected, the cloud environments that are being built, and the next wave being the machine learning and AI capabilities. There are more and more device manufacturers looking at how to leverage the power of machine learning to analyze images, analyze videos, to help them make diagnoses, to really just help them in some of the predictive areas. And that's going to require data moving freely back and forth to these cloud environments, having this analytics being run on the data, which opens up a lot of different risks from not only the safety and security side, but the privacy side also. But there's a big change here, and I have a couple examples here to illustrate what I talk about when I say the roles and responsibilities. So from a medical device manufacturer perspective, when you look at managing risk, they're predominantly focused on the managing the risk of that device. Now, they may have thousands of those devices deployed across thousands of hospitals, and those devices may be running on different code bases. However, they're responsible and they really care about the risk on that device. They've dealt with the safety risk aspects of this from, for example, ISO 14971 for years. And if there's issues, they'll do their investigation, run their probability data points, and then they may issue field corrections, recall products. Well, in the cybersecurity standpoint, same thing's happening. Managing risks on products, we're seeing more and more security researchers dabbling in the space and finding vulnerabilities that need to be addressed. We're seeing more and more pandemic vulnerabilities like Urgent 11, NotPetya, WannaCry come out that impact devices. And manufacturers are focused on their product, their release versions, and how they manage risk on that. So they look at it and think about it from the perspective of how do the security risks that come out impact this device? So recently we saw WannaCry in 2017 happen, and manufacturers looked at their product lines to understand when was the last time they patched, whether or not it was vulnerable to Bluekeep. Maybe some of them did testing to verify whether or not they were exploitable, and made a decision point on risk based on that data. In the summer, early fall timeframe this year, we heard about Urgent 11, which were vulnerabilities that were initially reported as impacting VxWorks and the IPNet stack implementation, which we've more recently learned that it impacts a number of other operating systems that leverage that same IPNet stack. And manufacturers then would have to look at their products, one, see if they're running VxWorks, two, see if they're running that version of IPNet or other OSs, and then three, evaluate and understand what the risk is in terms of their implementation and their deployment. So they're really focused on their device and how it's operating. Counter to that, the hospitals, they're responsible for managing security risk of a device in their clinical environment. Many hospitals, especially the larger healthcare systems, have thousands of devices from thousands of manufacturers, and they're responsible for understanding and managing risk in those environments. Therefore, that singular device from a single manufacturer presents greater opportunity for a broader risk in their environment, and they need to look at it from that perspective. So therefore, they think, how does this risk in this device impact the entire rest of the clinical environment? So when you separate these two, you think, all right, you've got a medical device vulnerable to Eternal Blue, which is the WannaCry, which is led basically to the WannaCry ransomware attack and other ransomware attacks after that. And the manufacturer looks at it and determines that the risk may be low or mitigated because of some certain controls they have in place. Well, a hospital has to look at it the same way and say, this device has this vulnerability. These are the mitigations we're aware of. Does this present a greater challenge to our entire clinical environment? Is there other concerns we need to worry about? Are there other mitigations, or are we not comfortable with what the manufacturers identified as mitigations, if that's even been communicated to them? So from a hospital standpoint, they're looking at risk through a different lens, and they have a much broader potential for impact in that environment that they're concerned about. So to highlight this as a bit of an example, I've got a beautiful slide here. I've got a graphics background. And, to me, I see a big black box. And one might think, well, what is inside of this black box? And I've got a number of little kids and they'll be intrigued by, well, if I open it up, what's in there? A hospital sees this as a big black box of potential risk. Now, when you look at it from a different perspective, now how do you view it? What if this black box is delivering some type of therapy to a patient and you're responsible for operating that black box and you're responsible for understanding and managing what's going on in that black box? There may be some level of discomfort because you don't know what it is, what it's doing. You're just trusting that the manufacturer designed the thing the proper way, that they have the proper configurations, the proper testing, the proper approvals from the FDA, which they'd have to be selling it to you. And now from a security standpoint, you have to trust it did the right thing from a security perspective. Now, how do you look at it when it looks like this? When that black box has connectivity to the hospital and that patient, and all those other beds in the hospital also have that same connectivity. But you, as a healthcare technology manager in a hospital, have no idea what is inside that black box other than the limited details you've been provided in maybe in instructions for use, or maybe in an older version of an MDS2 form, or maybe in a risk assessment that a hospital may have performed that was from years ago. Those health tech managers, biomedical engineers at hospitals are being put in a tough position to have all these black boxes all over their hospital that they don't understand what's happening inside of them. And one single black box could take down an entire hospital. Or in some cases, if you throw cloud environments into this, that one black box could take down multiple hospitals because of the cloud connectivity aspects. So this black box represents unknown risk. No idea of what the profile is and no idea of what the risk is. That unknown box could have been built 25 years ago because there are medical devices running in clinical environments that were built in the 90s. That black box could be running Windows NT or Windows 95 or Windows 2000 or Windows XP. And there are devices that are still running that in clinical environments. But without knowing the details of that box, it's very challenging to manage that risk. So the question that really drove a lot of this is how do you manage the risk of a black box? How do you manage that risk when you ask questions about what's inside that black box and you're not given answers? Or when you hear about a new pandemic vulnerability causing havoc, so much so that it's all over the news, and you have black boxes in your environment and you don't know whether or not that black box is impacted. And these are the challenges that hospitals are facing today, which is what's driving them to implement new capabilities. And the predominant areas where they're introducing these new capabilities are through the means of contract language and product security risk assessments. Contract language being lengthy 20-page long contract requirements that hospitals are levying upon manufacturers. Risk assessments are massive questionnaires that manufacturers are required to fill out and complete prior to a device being deployed within the clinical environment. In some cases, prior to a contract being signed. And some organizations look at these risk assessments, they identify gaps, and they ask or require manufacturers to remediate or mitigate those gaps before they'll purchase a product or within a time period after the product has been purchased. These are the two areas and basically the means by which providers can try to gather as much information about that black box as they can and levy as many requirements as possible on a manufacturer to properly manage security throughout that total product lifecycle of that black box. From an example perspective, I've got a couple examples here to run through, and I'm gonna click on some of these links and see if I can pull them up just to show you what they look like if you haven't seen them before. So example number one is the Mayo Clinic, and they provide all of this information on their website, and I have a link here in the PowerPoint slide. Mayo Clinic has also been out in front. They've been one of the first sets of organizations that really focused on this and really have revamped their approaches for cybersecurity for medical devices. And where they are now is they have this playbook, in essence, that identifies 6 areas that manufacturers have to work through before Mayo will purchase their product and before they'll deploy it within their environment. So the first one is, it's got this workbook which outlines all the capabilities and requirements for systems. The second one is requiring the MDS2 form, the manufacturer's disclosure statement on security, which, for those that aren't aware, was recently updated. So there's a new version available to download. The third element is architecture. They want to see the entire system architecture and how it fits within the Mayo environment. The third, or the fourth one here, are technical elements around the system: accounts, open ports, firewall rules. So think your Windows firewall rules or IP tables. The security capabilities around system hardening. Those are things like CIS benchmarks or DISA-STIGs, scanning requirements, vulnerability scanning of the device, anti-malware scans on the device. And then the big one, which is the hot topic these days, is the software bill of materials. So identifying all the software components that are in use in that product. The fifth one is the manual security testing results. So outputs from vulnerability scans, static application security testing scans, software composition analysis scans, penetration tests. So not only saying that you've completed these, but also providing the evidence that you've done it and providing evidence that you've addressed or identified mitigations for risks that were uncovered. And then finally is the information security schedule, which is basically their contract language. So the requirements that you must meet for them to purchase and continue to run this. Some of the big elements in the contract language, and we see it in other healthcare organizations, is requirements around patching. So how frequently a device is patched, how those patches are being deployed, for example. But I'm gonna Alt Tab here out of the screen just to pull up an example of this playbook here, just to show you what it looks like. So here's the Daniel, can everyone see the screen?
Yeah, it looks good. We can see the document.
Perfect. Okay. So this is the vendor packet provided by Mayo Clinic. And when you scroll through, you can see it gives you kind of a workflow of what they expect, descriptions of it, and then all the items that they're looking for. So they've got their embedded within the document. They have their diagram examples, their vendor workbook. So what they say, what they're looking for, and they're asking that all of this information be filled out to be submitted to them. And then the one down here at the bottom is the contract language. So you can see here's an example. This one is several pages long of requirements that are expected to put the device in the Mayo Clinic environment. So that's example one. The next example is the Naval Medical Logistics Command Medical Device Risk Assessment Questionnaire. And again, there's a link to that up here, the PDF document. And there are other government organizations like Department of Defense, Veteran Affairs, that have stringent requirements now for medical devices. A lot of them end up pointing towards DoD standards and NIST standards, but they've also created risk assessment questionnaires for devices. And this is an example of one from the NMLC. It's different, but from like the Mayo or from an MDS2, but it still looks for the same elements. The operating system details, what's the version, when is it out of support, what's the plans for when it's out of support, the architecture, so providing architecture and design diagrams and showing how it'll fit in their environment, open ports protocol, software bill of material, the hardware and firmware inventory, the application and details around access controls, identity access management, encryption, logging, and patching plans. So you're probably kind of catching the theme here a bit around what device what's the customers, the providers are looking for when you're purchasing a product from medical device companies. So here's the actual medical device assessment version 3.0. As you can see, it's another very comprehensive document, which is requesting all this specific information. It's even got various versions of operating systems they want you to check through, looking for system design and architecture elements. Very comprehensive. So they expect manufacturers to one, build the system to ensure all these capabilities are in place, and then also take the time to fill out and document what those controls are. The next example is one that many people are familiar with. And when I was talking to Daniel yesterday, he raised a great question around with the MDS2 form and its updates and the information that is being filled out in there, will that be able to replace these risk assessments that hospitals are requiring manufacturers to fill out? And from what I've seen so far, and from hearing from the industry, hospitals, as you can see in the Mayo Clinic form, are asking for an MDS2 form, and they're asking for all this other information in their risk assessment, in their architecture, and their contract requirements. So they're still asking for both. Now, with the way the new MDS2 form is set up, if you properly document all of your controls in the MDS2 form, you would potentially be able to leverage that as an easier way to fill out the assessment questionnaires from hospitals. The new MDS2 form is very comprehensive. This here just kind of highlights the elements that it's looking for. And if you're familiar with the NIST Cybersecurity Framework or NIST 853 or even ISO 2700 series, a lot of this kind of maps back there. So you've got audit controls, automatic log off, authorization, big one being the product updates. In healthcare, we talk a lot about data de-identification and how that is done and how that brings HIPAA into play for being a potential business associate. But this document is much more comprehensive than it was previously. It was a great update, and there's a great group that worked on it. And have the the example worksheet here. This is what the new MDS2 form looks like. It is a lot of fill in the blank yourself. So there's a lot of drop downs to answer certain questions and fill out notes. There's also a crosswalk to several of the other standards out here. So you see there's NIST 853 and ISO 2702 and TR 80001. But you can see it's looking for a lot more information and can really help you fill out those risk assessments. So, one recommendation folks in the industry constantly talk about is make sure you have an MDS2 form for all the products. Make sure it's accurately and properly documented and maintained. And that will not only help you with conversations with customers, but they will also have a different perspective of your organization if you show up with a completed MDS2 form and not just with boxes checked yes and no, but actually with details and information for them. And it will also make filling out those risk assessment questionnaires much easier. A couple other examples on how to prepare for these changes within your organization. So first one is really select a framework and build a strategy for implementation of that framework. This little icon that I've annotated here is from the Healthcare Sector Coordinating Council's Health IT and Joint Security Plan. The Sector Coordinating Council is an industry-led initiative that's focused on trying to close the gap on many of the issues, let's say specific to cybersecurity, that we identify in healthcare as part of some task forces that were created under the Obama administration. And one of them is focused on health IT and medical devices. The Joint Security Plan is a comprehensive document that provides a voluntary framework how you can implement security into your organization for products that you're developing. And this icon here is the actual framework, which then goes through the various elements of what you would want to build out, from your risk assessment and threat modeling to your requirements, design input, uh, software scanning, and then to your verification, validation testing, pen testing, and then your post-market operations. So that's a great document to start with. The second one is, once you've designed your framework and you've built out your roadmap, is create the organizational policies, processes, instructions, guidelines, and integrate them with the QMS. These are things like create your cybersecurity risk analysis or risk assessment process, dictate how you look at cybersecurity from a risk perspective using CVSS, exploitability categories of CVSS, mapped to the hazard list for potential impact, and dictate what things are determined to be low, medium, and high risk, and how that maps to controlled and uncontrolled risk per FDA definitions. And make sure these processes are part of the quality system. That makes it a repeatable process, an auditable process, and many of the regulatory agencies around the globe that are pushing out new guidelines and requirements are starting to state that you need to have evidence that security is integrated into your quality system. So not just that you have security built into the product, but that it's actually thought about and part of the QMS. The third one is, build security into the total product lifecycle. And I emphasize the including patching plans, because that has been one of the biggest gap areas with the medical device area to date. There's been a big shift in organizations building security in during design and development. So making sure there's appropriate controls in place in that design phase. However, there's still a challenge in terms of appropriately providing security updates and patches to products in the field. Now, there's been historically a thought that if you provide security updates to devices in the field, you have to go back through FDA to get recertified. FDA has been very clear that that is not true. And in most cases, unless the security patch is altering the intended use of the device, you're allowed to provide updates and patches to the device. Your internal processes such as V&V still need to be followed. And in their post-market cybersecurity guidance, they outline some certain criteria about the types of risk. But as long as you're not impacting the intended use and you follow your V&V, you can roll patches out. We're still seeing a major challenge with not only rolling patches out to devices, but in the cases where patches are getting pushed out, it's taking 6 months, 8 months, 12 months to develop, test, and roll out that patch. And on the hospital side, we see situations where hospitals may or may not implement those patches. It may take them a while to implement them. They may choose not to, which means that a manufacturer is going to have varying levels of products and their versions on the marketplace, because a lot of these patches may be tied to an operating system. And you could have a device with Windows 10 and a device that was patched last week, and a Windows 10 device that hasn't been patched since January of last year. So now you've got two different versions with two different software bill of materials and two different risk profiles. So those are some things to consider when you think about your patching and how you maintain these in the marketplace. And then a fourth example of how to prepare for this are to monitor and continually assess the success of the program. A lot of organizations that I've seen or I work with, they like to build out that roadmap. And if they haven't done any of this before, it's really emphasizing the pre-market. So build out the security capabilities for design and development, document those processes, implement them in the quality system, and start executing on products in development. And then circle back and do the same for the products in the marketplace. Put those processes in place for vulnerability disclosure. If a security researcher comes to you, what's your process? If a pandemic vulnerability comes out, what's your process? How does that workflow tie into the QMS? How do you communicate with customers? How do you communicate with the public? How do you talk to your regulators? So it's really kind of building out that roadmap and identifying the areas of how you're going to implement, and then continuously evaluating how successful your plan is. Some of the new areas that companies are starting to step into in the device world is manufacturing. implementing security controls on devices at the point of manufacture. So you can think about, code signing or implementing device keys for device-to-device authentication. There's the look at the manufacturing processes and how do you ensure that the ICS, the industrial control system solutions in manufacturing plants are properly built, properly up to date, properly configured and set up. Because what you don't want to have happen is somebody to infiltrate the manufacturing process and make changes or potentially create a greater downtime in a manufacturing environment to impact products going out to market, or to impact and have malicious software added into products as they go out. And as soon as a hospital plugs it in, it could infect their entire network. So constantly looking at how the program is working, what's successful, and what areas that could be improved upon. So I'll leave you just with a quote that I like to share, is that, in my company, we envision a world where every medical technology company has a robust program, that cybersecurity is integrated into the total product lifecycle, and that vulnerabilities are properly managed. If those elements are put in place, then there's a chance that, we're pushing out these life-saving technologies with proper security features, so they're secure, they're safe, they're trustworthy, and we're helping patient safety. So with that, I'll pause there and see what type of questions folks have. So Daniel, I'll flip it back to you.
Sounds good. Thank you, Colin. I actually have a question. You said US FDA, which reminded me that you have a lot of experience with other countries and what's going on there. Are you noticing, even though the regulations may be different, that the healthcare providers have similar or different programs when discussing cybersecurity and purchasing?
So the regulators, there's a growing list of them that are implementing guidance. It all kind of started with the US FDA with their pre-market guidance in 2014. So the US FDA has pre-market and post-market guidance. You've got organizations from countries like Canada, Australia, Japan, South Korea, China, Germany, that have, and there's a few more out there that have implemented guidance. For the most part, they're very similar. Many of them work throughout the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, IMDRF, and IMDRF issued a draft version of a white paper on recommendations for medical device cybersecurity back in October. So they're all communicating. However, there are some differences between the various guidance documents. Many of them focus on pre-market. The Australian one also touches on post-market. They talk a lot about recognizing standards like NIST, UL 2900, ISO for good controls to build your devices. The US draft version of their updated pre-market, which is being rewritten, they have made it clear that they're removing the tiering, which they'd put in there, and they're removing the cybersecurity bill of materials and going back to software bill of materials. So they originally had an idea to require not just the software components, but all the hardware components as well. And they heard enough feedback that they're going back to SBOM. However, Health Canada left CBOM in theirs. So there's a little bit of differences here or there. The one that I hear people have the most challenge with is China, where China has a pretty rigorous process, and their review of submissions is very, very, very critical.
Awesome. If anyone, oh, we got a question here. How do you suggest manufacturers work with remote patient monitoring scenarios where several entities are involved in setting up, operating, and maintaining devices? Healthcare delivery organizations, durable medical equipment vendors, home health agencies, cloud services for aggregating data, etc. From David.
So devices are devices is kind of how I look at it from that perspective. And whether a device is being deployed in a hospital, being worn by a patient, being deployed to the home, or even now integrated into your phone, the security practices that are identified through a lot of the standards and things like the JSP hold true in all those areas. You want to have proper, design architecture, proper security requirements. You want to do all the testing during design and development, before or during V&V to make sure you're looking for and addressing any problems you find. I think the uniqueness comes in a bit more when you talk about issuing the security patches and how you're going to maintain the device in the marketplace. And for each one of those, you kind of have to just look at how you're deploying them and what will work for your organization. So when I think remote monitoring at the home, you know, I kind of equate that to some of these home systems like your thermostats, or I just got one of those new robotic vacuums that has Wi-Fi. These all get security patches and they're all updated over the air, meaning that they're pushed down from the manufacturer. Most of them, knock on wood, would have some type of secure connection back to an environment. Typically, it's like a cloud IoT platform to be able to push these patches down. Again, in the device world, those patches have to be V&V to make sure they don't cause a problem. But there's still the ability to do a lot of this. But that's a very good question, and it gets very complex very quick when you talk about these how far you can stretch from a hospital to a patient and everything that's between.
So by the way, if you want to ask a question, I can, if you raise your hand, a little hand button, I can unmute you and you can ask it directly for the participants, or you can type it in the question box. I just want to make sure if you're okay being recorded, you can ask it yourself. Just click the raise hand button. So we have another question. The FDA issued a revised pre-market draft guidance in 2018, and there have been a lot of comments from the industry. Can you comment if FDA is looking at ISO 14971 as a basic framework, or are they thinking of cybersecurity risk management, a different framework to be developed by manufacturers?
So I can speak to recent updates that the FDA provided over the past month. There was a workshop about 2 weeks back down in the DC area run by AdvaMed, the Advanced Medical Technology Association, and the FDA spoke at that event. And what they shared was, one, they're rewriting the draft version. So the draft that came out before is going to be, sounds like substantially changed. And a new draft version is going to be coming out in the beginning of 2020 for review. And there will be another commenting period. Number two, they reference a number of standards within that document already, and we expect that there might be a few more added. They take the 14971 very seriously and how it relates to cybersecurity. I believe they actually already reference in their guidance TIR 57, the AMI TIR 57 document, which talks about cybersecurity risk management. And within that document, there is some nice representation and nice pictures that show a crosswalk between 14971 and the cybersecurity AMI TIR 57. So the way that a lot of organizations approach this is you have to look at cybersecurity risk from an exploitability perspective, not necessarily a probability, because how gaping of a hole does your solution have means that that's pretty easy to get through. And it just takes one person to take advantage of it. So when you think about exploitability, the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, CVSS, has an exploitability category and gives you a rating. So some companies take that exploitability rating and use that as their input to their risk. And then they use their hazard list from medical safety or their safety organizations, whomever develops that list of predefined hazards that can happen for that device, and then crosswalk them. Sometimes the security teams crosswalk it, sometimes the security teams provide the exploitability and the safety teams then do the crosswalk to the hazards. But in any element, it's a necessity to map the security and the safety together.
Right, and I think that's one of the reasons TR 57 kind of recommends having a separate but parallel, I guess. Is that the right way to put it, you think?
Yeah, separate but parallel.
Because sometimes a mitigation on the cybersecurity side could have a safety impact and vice versa.
Correct. Now, one area that it still leaves open for question is how do you manage cybersecurity risks that are not safety risks?
Like data loss or?
Data loss, business opportunistic, reputational, items like that.
Awesome. Great questions. If anyone else wants, they can raise their hand or type in a question in the question box. Not seeing anything else. So any final words, Colin? Thank you for
yeah, I was just going to say thank you for having me, and thanks to those on the phone that are learning about this fun new space and trying to help solve these problems. My contact info is up there with Daniel's. If anyone has any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, everyone.
For more information, visit medisao.com.